I just wanted to say that while we're thinking of artists who sort of had to wait to be discovered, is again to think about gender and the roles of women, and a lot of women who we're now rediscovering. And I think again, this exhibition has to be applauded for showing a real balance of women's contributions to this style. But the fact that a number of women found this as a way of trying to find entry into the art world, I think is a really important thing for us to consider. And certainly did have people like Hilary and others who were promoting it, but not always as generous to the women artists coming up with them. So.
Just to make a point about that, it's one of the things that's interesting in comparing the historiography of Latin America with certainly Europe and perhaps North America, is that there wasn't the exclusion of women from the art history. In other words, if you look back, nobody ever said Lygia Clark was less important, or Lygia Pape, or that Lydie Prati wasn't, a hugely important part of the movement. And that's interesting how these artists have kept the equality right from the moment the art was produced until today. There wasn't the filtering out of the female names, which happens in so many other places. Nobody says Gego is an important Mirashendo. The list is extremely long, and Maria Freire is very rich, and they've not had to be rediscovered as women. And that, I think, has been to me, it's a very noticeable difference with other art histories, where there has to be a revisionist project to bring the women back into the protagonism that they had at the time. And that completely opposes the stereotype most people have of Latin cultures, by the way.
I was just going to say, perhaps that's one of the values of having those strong groups, because you identified with the group, and through your art produced through the group, put you up front.
Hi, I thought that the talk on Albers was wonderful. It was very inspiring. And you're right, he wasn't the first non-Mexican to be inspired by Mexico. My question really is this: you're talking a lot about canons, and I guess being an iconoclast, I'm always bothered by canons. And I wondered if you were to be asked by non-experts in your country, city, or 30s or 50s, what would you say the influence of the people who you talked about today is on the rising architects and artists now?
So the question, so what is the influence of these artists on artists of today?
Or architects?
Or architects, you mean both, yeah.
Well, I'll just speak very quickly about Albers. First of all, just in relation to an audience for his work, I'm not sure that people realize that it was only after he retired from teaching in 1960, when he was already 72, that he started even selling works. So he was well into his 70s when he really started having a lot of gallery shows and selling his works. Fortunately, he lived to a ripe old age and painted until about a week before he died. So he produced an enormous amount in that very concentrated period. And of course, his impact on architects and architectural through his education was huge. I can't go into it now, and I'm not sure, I haven't really studied it, but he continues to be, an artist who is studied by architects. Gropius certainly sent students from Harvard to Black Mountain College continually to have Albers' education because of what he brought to the conception of space and construction and so on. And I think that today there is really a great interest among students. We have a lot of groups of students who come to the foundation to look at his work. Unfortunately, it's not always taught in studio courses, which seem to be very focused on theory, something that Albers didn't like. But there is still a tremendous interest in his work and lessons to be learned from it, I think.
I'll insist that I think the influence on younger artists today of this generation, I mean, we're talking, you know, different 30s, 50s, but it depends on the exposure these artists have. In these countries, I think Brazil and Venezuela, Argentina, these artists are starting to be more influential in the last 10 years just because of, again, the exposure, collections are being formed, exhibitions are being done. The literature on these has expanded in the last 10 years in a way, I mean, like really a lot. And so you know, who is represented in New York by a gallery? Is there a state formed? Those are key questions, key issues in assessing the influence of these artists.
I think too, like with Biederman as well.
Biederman was visited by local architects frequently. And they would come into his studio and just hang around with him and talk and look. And he made a group of architectural models, some of them very fanciful, way out. But he made them in cardboard that hasn't survived too well. He made one model in plastic that is gorgeous. So he aspired to do architecture, but he was lucky that he could do his constructions. And architects came and borrowed ideas, and Charles Stinson, who's a well-known architect in Minneapolis, was a collaborator with Biederman. But then Biederman got mad at him because Stinson's work he thought was too close to his, so there's always this little friction, you know. But he would have loved to have been an architect.
One of the things that seemed to emerge from your talks collectively is something that struck me about a couple of the individual artists that I had known about before, and that's an almost like aggressive will to disregard any kind of hierarchy between media, which is so prominent in the modernist agenda that painting is privileged, for instance. But with Albers, with Biederman, with Ferren to a great extent, something that you all touched on is this will to elide media, almost to the point that things aren't really really characterizable, and even, you know, in Pape, really asserting that the woodcuts are paintings. So I wonder if you could talk about that, you know, in your individual artists or in the pedagogical backgrounds that may unify some of them unexpectedly, books that came out. I'm thinking of something that you guys haven't talked about, but the Institute of Design in Chicago, Moholy-Nagy and Kepish, publishing books that may have been disseminated throughout the Americas. So what kind of effect may have that had on breaking down these boundaries?